It seems to me that his work does partake more of poetry or of painting than of prose. Like looking at Lisa and the Devil is like looking at sometimes a pre-Raphaelite painting or something, and it's got the same kind of narrative function. Welcome to Totally Pretentious, a podcast about great movies. I'm David.
And I'm Sean.
And on today's show, we'll discuss Mario Bava's 1974 film, or rather 1972 film, that didn't really show up until 1974, Lisa and the Devil, starring Elke Summer, Telly Savalas, and Sylvia Krishina.
This is your film, we should note, because you told me to watch this, David, and so
I did.
What is about to happen, I just want you to know you brought it upon yourself. Because I watched both versions of this film.
Oh, you poor man.
Oh no, I suspect we're about to have a disagreement about which film is better.
You liked The House of Exorcism better? Oh, you are now being booted into the sun by every cinephile on the planet.
Well, too bad, because I submit only one of these two films makes any sense.
Okay, yeah, we're going to have an interesting discussion.
We are. But it's been a while, David. I haven't seen you around for movie-related conversations because we've both been busy doing things. You writing 6,000 new books, including, as I recall, you might have written a Dr. Doom book?
I did, yes. The Harrowing of Doom, my first Marvel novel for Aconite Books. So, and Dr. Doom's been my favorite Marvel character for my entire life, pretty much. So that was pretty special.
I think we've learned a lot about you, David, by you telling us which of your Marvel characters is your favorite. Mine is not that character, but that's okay.
Which one is yours?
I'm a Darkhawk fan, which basically nobody knows who that is except super Marvel dorks, because he hasn't really been in comics since the 90s, so...
Yeah, he was one that I missed, at least I don't recall from the peak of my comics reading in the late 80s, early 90s.
Well, that makes me so sad, but we'll just have to deal. So David selected this film, and so I think it would be a good time for David to give us a little bit of context and to give us a summary. But before we do that, this is a reminder for folks that if you want to share your comments about this episode or this film or other things that we've discussed on the show, or you want to suggest other topics, please go to skiffingandfanty.com/listener-suggestions. We're working on putting together a mailbag segment, so we need your thoughts, questions, topic suggestions, etc. So make sure to go there and do that. So on that note, David, I'm going to throw this to you to tell us what this movie is about, give us a little bit of context, explain to us why the heck you picked it.
Well, this is, I think, one of Mario Bava's most beautiful films. So Mario Bava, the director who was perhaps the most responsible for the Italian horror movie. His first official directorial effort was Black Sunday, also known as the Mask of Satan, with Barbara Steele. That was shot in a truly beautiful black and white, with some imagery that. Some of the look of it that might evoke memories of the contemporary Seventh Seal. When he moved into color, there was a sumptuousness to this beautiful use of reds and blues of lighting, conjuring the most extraordinary images, sometimes out of very limited budgets, as in his Planet of the Vampires, which is a film that from 1965 that is a direct ancestor to Alien. Lisa and the Devil is one of his later films, shown in Cannes in 1972, and then almost immediately, the version that was Lisa and the Devil would vanish and not be seen really by anyone until it was restored in the 90s, I believe, is when we could finally it became possible to see that film. Because the producer took it away, basically removed about 20 minutes of Bava's film, inserted a bunch of footage of Robert Alda as a priest exorcising Elke Summer, who's vomiting toads, and it went out on release as The House of Exorcism, directed by Mickey Lyon, which was a pseudonym for Mario Bava. All of the scenes of Valda and the exorcism, none of that was done by Mario Bava. And so it became a film that was just regarded as a sad butchery of what he had done, but very few people could, there was a hint, or there was some sense of what the original was like in the House of Exorcism. It wasn't an uninteresting movie, but his vision was utterly distorted. And then finally, the restoration happened in the 90s, and we could see the movie as it actually was. One of the reasons I chose this film was, I think, precisely anticipating the reaction you just gave me a teaser for. The story, in brief, has Elke Sommer as a tourist who goes down the wrong path in a small village in Italy, gets hopelessly lost in the maze of streets after a disturbing encounter with Telly Savalas buying a mannequin in a store. Said mannequin then shows up, and the man comes up to Summer and claims that that they're in love and that he knows her. And then she accidentally kills him, pushing him down the stairs. But then we see Savalas again holding the mannequin. This is the beginning of this back and forth between people who are alive and then dead, and then they weren't alive in the first place because they were dummies. From the town, she then in the middle in the night is picked up by some people in a strangely anachronistic vehicle and taken to this villa where all sorts of bizarre things start to happen. Essentially, what I would say, we are in a kind of deliriously romantic version of Sartre's No Exit. Now, I've made this probably sound a little more abstract than people would like, but that's because of the nature of the film. Trying to summarize Lisa and the Devil in a strictly linear way, this happens and this happens and this happens, will sound like trying to explain a dream you've had. It's not quite as oniric as Succubus, which the Jess Franco film that I subjected you to, but I was kind of anticipating that the reaction would be not that different.
So I find it amusing that you refer to this, your description, as abstract, because I gotta be honest, David, your description makes a lot more sense than a first viewing of this film would entail. Because this film is, I think you use the phrase like, it's like a dream, and that's kind of what it is. I think somebody on Twitter was mentioning this to me as well, that it's like a sequence of dream sequences, that it follows a dream logic in the way that it's constructed, or at least that's how I envision it. And I think this is what the House of Exorcisms version tries to capitalize on by making it into like a sequence of memories that are fragmented. This film just lacks that frame narrative to explain why we're getting things that seem like they don't connect with one another or aren't explained or seem to come out of left field. And so it's an unusual film, David, that you have selected, you absolute monster. I really struggled with it, I will say,
Yeah.
precisely because I was trying to put things together to figure out what was really going on, because it seems at moments that this film jumps. Right, at one moment we're in one place, and then suddenly we're in another. There were sequences in this, like where there's romances being hinted at, that just seemed like they come from nowhere. They're unexplained, and some of them I think is it makes sense because the character of Lisa seems very confused by them. So the figure of Carlos, who sometimes is a dummy and sometimes is a person and sometimes might be both, is an example of this, who like confesses love to her and all of these things, and she seems deeply confused by this, understandably, being accosted by a man in the middle of a fairly medieval looking Italian villa. But in other cases, like in the figure of Maximilian, played by Alessio Arano, they seem to have a love together, and yet it's very difficult to figure out why, given that they've literally just met like 37 seconds ago, and yet are engaged in what seem to be romantic behaviors. Now, for Maximilian, it makes sense because his character has an infatuation with a figure named Elena, who is dead-ish, and he may or may not be sleeping with her corpse. It's not entirely clear. So he has that relationship, but Lisa doesn't. She doesn't technically know him or at least that's what I took from this. And so that those things seem to come out of left field for me. I get how there is a dream sequence quality to this, or dream logic quality, but it is difficult to follow, especially if what you're hoping for is for the story to like give you a moment of like, hey, here's an explanation of what's going on. The film doesn't do that. It almost never explains what's happening. I think this is where you and I sometimes differ about what we like in films. Which may
Yeah.
explain why you love Hereditary in a way that I will never understand, because to me, that film in particular, it doesn't make sense. So that when I got to the end and a thing happened, that didn't have the impact that I think it was meant to do. And that somewhat is true here, although I think this film is better than Hereditary in that at least the end of this movie, the correct version, Lisa and the Devil, there is a somewhat shocking conclusion in the death of Maximilian, who is basically knocked over by either dummy or actual dead version of his mother, which is a pretty interesting ending. And then, of course, there is a sequence where Lisa basically climbs into a taxi, escapes, she's confused for a ghost, and then she basically leaves Italy as quickly as possible. So that, I think, is a much more interesting ending than I think what Hereditary does. So I will shut up because I'm sure you have thoughts about everything I've just said, and you want to tell me why I'm wrong and why it's just because you're an American and you don't understand subtlety. So go for it.
Well, I mean, certainly, obviously, we disagree on Hereditary, and I certainly have never found that it didn't make sense. In fact, I found it's got this kind of quite intricately malevolent logic to it, and a very, very different kind of film than this. And let's recall too that and obviously we're into total spoiler territory here, that Lisa doesn't escape, and I think one of the key things here is she's not mistaken for a ghost. She is a ghost, right? And we then see her, going onto, thinking she's getting away, boarding onto a plane, but oh look, there's Telly Savalas, the devil,
right,
waiting for her. Then, and she just falls down as a corpse.
I love that sequence, by the way. I think that whole sequence is really cool.
Oh, and boy, the eeriness of an empty plane. Of course,
Yeah.
watching it this time, I thought, oh, okay, she's flying during a pandemic. I think once you've seen it in its entirety, the film does make sense if you are seeing this as essentially as No Exit, right? These characters are all damned souls reenacting in one way or another the situations that brought them to damnation, and bringing in new variations of it. So the corpse that Lisa is lying beside in the bed is also her. But Phil Hardy's Encyclopedia of the Horror Film calls Bava the master of funereal lyricism, and talks about the film's morbid romanticism, which I think both of these things are absolutely true. And yes, you can approach it as a dreamlike logic, but as a film, as a dream. One of the big differences between the predominantly American approach to the horror film and I would say, well, certainly the continental European approach to a lot of the horror film, less so for Britain, which is closer, I think, to the American, though distinct in itself as well. But then we also see, but I think we would see in common with the Japanese horror film as well, would be almost the difference between saying that one is prose and the other is poetry. So if we look at the way that the horror film developed in the States, and let's recall that the horror film began on the European continent, began in France, and reached its first feature flowering in Germany. And really, though the term horror movie originates in the States, but in many ways we have to wait until the 30s for the American horror film proper to take its form. We have some earlier instances, certainly, but like the Supernatural, for instance, is virtually non-existent in the American horror film, at least after the very early years of the 20th century. But when we're in the 1920s, for example, all the supernatural is always being explained away. And so if we look at the horror films as they developed under the studio system and the classical form of storytelling developed by that system, you are going to see a much more linear, rational, in quotation marks, comparatively, approach to storytelling. And I think to a certain degree we see that split between American and European approaches to horror would continue on for decades. I'm generalizing somewhat, but I think that we do see this particular trend. And if you look at let's say, two vampire films coming out at almost the same time. Todd Browning's Dracula with Bela Lugosi and Carl Dreyer's Vampire. And the difference between those two films is stark. And though the American films would be strongly influenced by German Expressionism, in no small part because a lot of the artists of the German Expressionist films had moved to Hollywood. So Karl Freund, for example, doing the cinematography on Dracula. Dracula plays out in a way that is linear, in a way that Vampire is utterly dreamlike. Like trying to figure out exactly what's going on and why in Vampire. Basically everything you just said about Lisa and the Devil, you'd also be saying about that film. And so much of the European tradition of the horror film flows like this. Lisa and the Devil is perhaps one of the more pronounced in its poetic and dreamlike approach, but it's hardly unusual. Like Succubus, perhaps, is even more pronounced in that way, even more extreme. But this is something that my friend and fellow writer Steve Sullivan and I have been talking about. We've been doing watch-alongs for the last few months of Paul Naschy films, and now we've started doing some Mario Bava. And he has commented a number of times on the way time seems to be slippery in European horror films. How suddenly it's another full moon, or how did we get from A to B isn't very clear. That the connective tissue that you are used to in the American form of storytelling is not there. But in the same way that you wouldn't expect that in a poem, you're not going to expect the same kind of connective tissue to get from one stanza to the next as you would in a prose short story. And I think that's one of the differences here. And when you look at like Bava's work, so visually rich. Like it seems to me that his work does partake more of poetry or of painting than of prose. Like looking at Lisa and the Devil is like looking at sometimes a pre-Raphaelite painting or something, and it's got the same kind of narrative function as one of those.
Well, I think it's interesting that because one of the things that you shared on Twitter, which I thought was this was before I had seen the film, and you shared this shot with everybody from this film, which is one of the exterior shots. I believe it's the shot towards the end when she's leaving the mansion, which the mansion's been overtaken by nature, and so there's trees and vines and stuff growing through it. And she's leaving, or the ghost version of Lisa is leaving, believing she's going to get on an airplane and go home. And I think you're right in a sense that this film is like a sequence of paintings that are being brought to life, rather than having a very what would be in an American sense, or something like in House of Exorcism as an example, which is there's a very clear through line, right? A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D, right? So the whole point of the very beginning, right? We have this tour sequence, and then she gets sick, and there's all these added sequences in which there's a priest that's brought in, and then there's the interconnection between her in what is clearly some sort of like hallucinogenic memory fueled state where she's remembering things that have happened as a consequence of being possessed by a devil creature. And so we get those interspersed, her being possessed and having these memories and going through this. And then we get to the conclusion in which it's not, in fact, her leaving on the airplane. That is all taken out. It's instead the priest conducting an exorcism in the house, and successfully, or at least we're led to believe successfully.
But doesn't he get blasted by lightning?
He gets blasted by lightning. It's kind of hard to know exactly. So either he is successful and also dies, or not. He does get thrown around a lot. so I'm not 100% sure, but I think that they're allowed a little bit of ambiguity. But he might be just vapored. Yeah. But I think there's a clear, stark difference between the type of story that goes along with what you're saying here. That House of Exorcism wants there to be an A, B to C. And the version, at least of the Devil, does not. I mean, there are moments that you could maybe argue are, an A and a B and a C, but there's nothing that's necessarily tying all of those pieces together as some sort of formal linear narrative. And so in that respect, it is visually, I think, much more important of a film than it is necessarily as a narrative. That what we're being shown, and in some cases the dialogue that's being given to us, and the performances, those become much more significant components of how we understand what Lisa and the devil is actually about, and more importantly, the characters and their traumas that they're going through. Naturally, we have to question whether or not the devil is, in fact, as I like to refer to him, Blofeld, because that's who he did, in fact, play at one point. He is implied to be the devil or some sort of malevolent spirit, possibly Satan. But yeah, so
well, he even calls himself the devil at one
he
point,
does, yeah.
and we do the opening credits say Lisa and the devil, and we see, and there he is.
Right. Yeah, it's strongly
He's and there
telling
he
us.
is also sucking. Oh, sorry, sucking lollipops just before playing Kojak.
Well, and apparently he did that because he had quit smoking, the actor. Yeah. So
That's right. And but he really works it in as a hilarious bit of business in a number of scenes. He does seem to be having an extraordinary amount of fun with the role. But yeah, I mean, and I think the that's interesting what you're saying about the way House of Exorcism kind of imposes this A to B to C, or at least explains away like the stuff that you can't connect to A to B to C. It says, oh well, yes, this won't connect, so here's just some stuff.
yeah, or it just cuts it all together.
Yeah, and there, of course, we are seeing, I mean, obviously the impact of The Exorcist.
Yes.
Right. Which, and I mean, and there, of course, I mean, a horror film that went out of its way to, well, on the one hand, grounding itself in a kind of realism that had never been seen before, really, as at least in this particular approach to the supernatural, even though it has its own oniric qualities and the aspects that are not fully explained. But nonetheless, no one's going to be really, as far as the main thrust of the narrative of The Exorcist is concerned, no one's going to be confused about how we got from A to B to C. And then it would, of course, spawn no end of imitators in Europe. I think it's Luigi Cozzi who once said that in Italy, producers don't ask you, what is your film like? They ask you, what film is your film like? That is why we will always be making Zombie 2 and never Zombie 1. I mean, and certainly we'd see that effect with all of the Exorcism rip-offs and variations that would come out of there. And so Alfredo Leone would turn Lisa and the Devil into one of those Exorcist rip-offs. And with perhaps importing some of that attempt to impose a certain kind of sense, whereas the original film is not interested in that at all. But if the usual narrative threads are missing, the thematic ones are, right? As we see Lisa move from one labyrinth to another labyrinth, the repetitions of characters coming back over and over, dying and then resurfacing and coming back only to die again, then moving into the orgy of violence that gradually consumes everyone as the murders all happen, only to then give us a sense that this has happened before and it's going to happen again. Right. Lisa cannot escape this. She thinks she has, but she hasn't. It's just we're into another circle of hell as we get at the end. And even there, the reading I am imposing here is one that is certainly very much arguable. It's a film that deliberately is leaving itself open to interpretation. You can't nail down precisely what's going on in Lisa and the Devil any more than you can in 2001: A Space Odyssey. But it is of a piece.
Yeah.
Right. Visually, the extraordinary exteriors, and then the glamorousness of decay that we get in the interiors, the romanticism of Joaquin Rodrigo's Concerto de Aranjuez, which plays during the one of the most explicitly necrophile scenes in Bava's career, something that it certainly rotates around, revolves around in a number of his films. So all of this is of a piece, right? It's Lisa and the Devil has a unity and a coherence that the House of Exorcism just flat out doesn't, because there's this other thing that's being brought in, and a kind of Procrustean bed of a narrative upon which the original film is being stretched and cut.
Yeah, so it's interesting. You were talking a moment ago here about the visual presentation, right? The location shots, and you're making me think a lot about something that I really miss about like very stylized films, especially from this period, is there's just a lot of attention to the locations that are being that
Mm-hmm.
a thing is being shot in, about what's present on the screen. I mean, even in this film, there's this really interesting sequence when they're all sitting awkwardly around this like mechanized little table with the little figures that spin, and one of them is clearly a figure of death. There's all of that present there. There's so much attention here to this sort of almost gothic style mansion, and it's
Mm-hmm.
interior shots, dealing with all of the, like, there's a sense of like extravagance, but old extravagance throughout, and there's even the sort of matriarchal figure and the figure of the mother here, and even the external shots of them out with all of the just these massive fountains and pillars and all of this stuff that feels like you've wandered back 100 years or more, and it's
Yeah.
all throughout this. And so even when you get to that end sequence, when she quote unquote wakes up, and she wakes up on the bed, and it's the same room we've seen before, but now it is covered in vines and trees and all kinds of wildlife and creatures. You still get that sense, but now you're watching something that has gone through this process of decay over an absurd amount of time. I mean, I think it's interesting that you mentioned the car when it was anachronistic. That is sort of like your first big clue that
Yeah.
we're not in Kansas anymore. We're in we're
No.
in some other place, and it's very ominous, the whole presentation, and even the return of the devil figure, constantly coming back and reappearing in her life over and over. That sort of couples with the way that this whole visual presentation is there, because he becomes sort of tied into the sort of management of this space. Like, he is literally the like butler of death, as well as the butler of life, in a twisted way, but in the same space. So there's just a lot, I think, visually that you could just have a heyday with, in terms of
Yeah.
what we're shown. And I'm sure if you've seen this more than I have, so I've only seen it twice now, technically. And so it's a thing that I noticed a lot, just thinking about all of the visual presentations and the amount of detail that's in any given
Mm-hmm.
scene, the amount of stuff, even like the moments when the devil figure is like in his like giant room, this massive room with all of the like filigree and stuff all over the like mirrors and windows and all of that. And he's just in a room full of dummies and dummy heads just everywhere. And all of them are slightly different, and some of them are bleeding and bloody. It's a lot of detail just even there. And there's lovely transitions, I will say, between when they're clearly dummies, but then they become very lifelike. And
Yeah.
it's really creepy. It's very creepy.
Well, and Savalas's devil. He's also. I think. I mean, everything you said about him there, I would agree with completely. And as well as all of that, also he's our master of ceremonies,
Yes.
right? Which is how he is presented in the opening credits, right? Sort of smiling at us and laying out the cards that the characters are going to be on, also as a kind of magician. And we get that lovely little sleight of hand he does when he's caught smoking, and by the matriarch, incidentally played by Alida Valli of The Third Man, and later of Suspiria and Inferno. And then he swaps the cigarette for the lollipop. And we see his master of ceremonies aspect kick in when we suddenly get that impromptu funeral procession after the first murder.
Yeah.
Right, and notice how he directs everyone to stand in a certain way and then follow. Like he's a master of puppets, which these dummies are as well. And when Lisa suddenly collapses as a rotting corpse, the way she falls is as a puppet whose strings have suddenly been cut. Right, a kind of sort of jerky descent. She drops in stages, very much like a broken puppet. So we have his presiding presence playfully and perversely and in a macabre way, taking us through one strange incident after another. And to come back to what you're saying about time, right? I think you said the car is the first clue that okay, things are going slippery here. Emphasized by when the children run away from Lisa when she emerges from the mansion, and they say no one's lived there for hundreds of years.
Right.
So even that car now becomes open to question, right? It opens up all sorts of possibilities, right? Like how long has this been going on? When did all of these murders take place? I mean, Maximilian's clothes are considered, he's dressed in a way that's quite a bit older than that of the people who picked Lisa up in the car, and they're dressed in a way that's older than she. And yet, she has the flashback memories. She's in a much older period costume. So time has ceased to have any kind of meaning in this place.
Yeah, it's very much like a ghost story that you hear a lot of the same incidents happening but sucking in new life into the repetition, right? So like each of these people come from different times, and so you could read this as literally one of them was the original ghost figure, and it has sucked them all in one at a time. And that's what this place does, is it sucks people in and they become part of its nightmare.
And even that becomes difficult when clearly Lisa is not a new arrival, right? She may not remember what she may not understand why she is there, and yet there's her body up rotting in the bedroom, and everyone there knows her.
Right.
And we have we are told of a love triangle that ended in murder. But even there, if we just say, okay, it's just that reenacting itself, well, but no, because these people seem to be from different times.
It's sort of something you were saying a little much earlier, which is that they're repeating these things over and over, but there's a difference each time. And so over time, as these new, whenever they've arrived, right, the narrative that they all repeat has had to shift to include these new individuals as part of what ultimately is a trap, right? It's a trap that they all just die. It's just a matter of when they die in a set of sequences that seems to matter. It's almost in a weird way they're repeating a ceremony of their own, and that ceremony is literally the arrival into this space, which then eventually, as the process of spending time there, they eventually come to their deaths. And their deaths are maybe predetermined because they're ghosts. It's unclear. That really, like, if we treat him as an actual devil figure who is doing puppet strings, all he's doing is the same play. He just is now adding new actors in the play.
Yeah, or perhaps picture him playing with a huge dollhouse, and he's dressing the dolls up differently each time. We kind of see with all these, he's just got very large dolls that he's playing with.
You're not wrong, because it does feel at times like he is playing with just life-size dolls. I mean, he's just carrying these, like when the mother shows up. I thought this was very well shot when she's been killed by her son, stabbed in the, like, basically straight into the heart. Very phallic given what has happened immediately before that, I will note.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
We got all the incest and necrophilia that we could hope for in this.
Yes, precisely. And when she walks in, right, something's wrong immediately. I mean, she's supposedly dead, so that's obviously wrong. But the way that she moves is very stiff. It doesn't feel like she's actually walking. Her body doesn't move that way. Of course, that's precisely what we're shown, because this devil figure basically has scared the son to fall to his death out of the window. He's impaled on something, on like a fence or something. And then he pops his head around, and it's like, oh, like, so sad, like that you died.
Also catching the Alida Valley dummy as if it got away from him.
Right. Yeah.
And is about to fall over. And when then we do see then Maximilian again when Lisa emerges from the bedroom, and now he's just an ivory white statue overgrown with vegetation,
right,
in the same position that we saw him in.
Yeah, there's a lot of just really interesting ways that it's dealing with its imageries of death, and I guess you could call them apparitions if you want to call them ghosts, and the strange way in which I think this film does imply like infinite variations of a possible theme. We're shown one variation, but you could imagine that these could be told in markedly different ways depending on the puppet master, as it were.
Yeah. Or and what seems to be tickling his fancy at that particular moment.
And I think that's interesting that you say what tickles his fancy, because compared to everybody else in this film, he absolutely is playing this sort of like a trickster figure. He's very playful. He's very vibrant, and he does make some little jokes. clearly uncomfortable in his relationship to other people. Like, he makes them uncomfortable is what I mean. But there is a
Yeah.
joy to the performance he's giving, which is a
Yes.
horrifying
Yeah.
idea, given that these are people who are going to die horrible deaths in the process of this story, and yet he's almost like dancing on tiptoes and like just having a good time
Yeah.
throughout this.
He's one of the cheeriest devils in film, and so caught up in the humor of the situation, and I think what you say there about the horrible deaths is worth emphasizing as well, because I mean the along with the gorgeous lyricism of the imagery, the deaths are really violent.
Yeah.
Right, when they come and they start quite late into the film. They're really brutal, right? People being beaten to death, being run over repeatedly with a car, along with the stabbings. I mean, they don't die easily.
No.
And I wanted to just come back on another point that you raised when you're talking about the locations. And this is something, too, that I think what's one of the great joys of the continental European horror film is that even the films with considerably lower budgets than this, and this wasn't a big budget film either. I mean, none of them would have had the means of like the major studios in the States if when they wanted to commit to these. But what they do have is the abundance of locations, right? You want a good looking ruined castle? Well, there's one right over there. Right.
Yeah.
You want a strange, eerie streets. Here you go. Right. The Bava uses locations brilliantly in here. That sense of that in the early scenes. I just love the way that Lisa, like her sense of being lost, is utterly convincing. Right, and I'm reminded here of Don't Look Now, and the way that Nicholas Roeg turns Venice into a maze, right? Where suddenly you get this claustrophobic sense of all the streets, of none of the streets leading to somewhere where you can get a vista of and the landmark and get a sense of where you are. Instead, you're trapped by these high walls with shuttered windows and all twisting and turning and leading to places that aren't really places. And he gets a similar kind of disorientation in his superb ghost film, Kill Baby Kill, where there too the actual location becomes a fairy tale like setting for the story, and where that sense of disorientation is so deliberate that we have a scene in the haunted villa where the hero is chasing after a figure. As he goes after this person, we start to realize he's running through the same room over and over again. And as he gets closer and closer to the figure he's catching, when he finally catches up to that figure, it's himself. So our sense of space is completely blown apart there. And he does some similar kinds of things here, but even more so with time.
I think it's interesting. One of the things that you made me think of here is, if you watch this film for the first time, and if what you're expecting is well, I didn't expect this, but normally what I would expect would be, a narrative that has an obvious through line. Mm-hmm. You're going to find yourself really confused by, like, everybody in this is deeply uncomfortable in this mansion, right? The space itself it feels antiquated. It feels like it's harboring something ill will. Even the mother figure she comes across as very cold and distant and honestly somewhat mad, right? The son is overly interested in everybody else to the point that he seems, I would argue, creepy because of his excessive interest. He wants everybody they're so lonely. Everybody needs to come. He's so lonely. And so there's this sense throughout this film that, these characters are in this moment where in a space where you keep wondering, why don't they just leave? Because clearly nobody's having a good time here. Why don't they just get in the car or go or look, we're uncomfortable. We appreciate all of the effort, but like, we're just going to go to one of those roadside inns that is mentioned early on because their car breaks down, which is how they end up here.
Right. And we've already seen from the opening scene with Lisa getting lost that no, you can't leave. Wherever it is you are, you're not going to leave until the devil lets you go to the next place that you can't leave.
Right. And I think that's really important, is you may not pick this up until you get. Honestly, I didn't get it till the very end, because the second she gets on that airplane, you have one of two options there. You're like, oh, okay, she's gonna get away and everything's gonna be fine. She had a horrible experience. She's gonna be traumatized, but she's gonna live. That's one possibility that happens. But she's looking around and she's like, oh, this is like, she's having these looks, and they don't show it, which is very clever. Bava shoots this brilliantly, which is has her kind of look around like a little awkwardly, just like, oh, I'm just kind of looking and things don't look quite right. And then eventually we get this shot slowly comes out as she begins to move around, when we realize this massive 2-tier airplane has nobody on it. And that's the moment when you realize, oh no, the options we thought we had don't exist. She is trapped in a circle, and a loop. Yeah, she's trapped in a loop.
Yeah.
And I think that's the moment when you start to realize, like, why doesn't everybody just leave? They're so uncomfortable. Well, it's because they can't. They literally cannot leave. This house has sucked them in. This devil figure has sucked them in, and they are pawns in a game they have no control over. It made me think a lot of a science fiction take on this, which is I have no mouth but I must scream by Harlan Ellison. Right. In which an evil artificial intelligence that's invented by man has taken over the world and is keeping this small group of humans alive solely so it can torture them and play with them. They can't kill themselves because it'll revive them. If they mouth off to it, it takes their mouth away. If they do anything to try to get out of this cycle, it ultimately does things to them. And so they're at the mercy of this entity. It's similar to this, just this is much more surreal in its portrayal, where they just simply can't leave. It's not a possibility. Yeah. And I think that because Lisa's our center point in how we experience most of this, with some exceptions to some sequences with Maximilian, this lends an air of claustrophobia for a space that's actually quite large. I mean, This mansion's not tiny. It's not a small mansion. Like, it's massive.
But I think you're completely right, because that opening scene in the village feels to me intensely claustrophobic. You keep hoping you're going to be able to see over the walls, and you never can.
No.
Right? You can't. You never return to that wide open square where the tourist bus was. Right? So I think you're right that it is claustrophobic. The intensity of what the characters are going through, the sense of being trapped by something. And I would also add, too, that this is, when you're talking about sort of expectations, and I think what you said is true, but also the more horror films from Italy in particular, from Italy and Spain, I would say in particular, that you see, the more this kind of thing starts to feel, I don't know if expected is quite the right word, but familiar. So for instance, we go back to the 60s and Castle of Blood, where our protagonist makes a bet with Edgar Allan Poe that he will be able to survive the night in this house, and then he's trapped by ghosts reliving the murders that brought them there, and he's then pulled into that and killed himself. So you can see a lot of the same idea as Lisa and the Devil. The dreamlike qualities of what's going on, who's alive, who's dead, who are they now. There's an obscurity that was only seen, I think, by a few hundred people upon its initial release, and until it came out on DVD. Nude for Satan, which follows the same kind of dreamlike logic that we get in Lisa and the Devil. Tombs of the Blind Dead, which was a big hit coming out of Spain with the wonderful Templar zombies. Zombies that get to ride horses and use swords seem a little bit like cheating, but it too has this sort of bizarre logic, like suddenly you've got reanimated corpses. Why? Just because.
Just because.
This dreamlike tradition, which we would see also in some of Dario Argento's films, the non-giallos like Suspiria and Inferno. It's everywhere in the horror film tradition there. And we encounter, like I said, I think we see this in a lot of Japanese horror films too. And I remember seeing a comment about one of the differences between the Japanese horror film tradition and the American horror film tradition. And this commentator saying that American audiences want the films to make sense. The Japanese audiences don't care as long as it's scary.
Oh, well, that would go back to when we did House. Although that one is much more of a comedic horror in that respect.
comedic,
Yeah.
but it's got this. But I mean, really, House and Lisa and the Devil have a lot in common, don't they? In
Yeah.
the sort of, okay, now this is happening. Why? Because.
Right. I mean, there's an interesting aspect of that, which is, and I wonder if there's been some full like studies on like a cultural analysis of why it is that, at least in the United States. I can't speak to basically any other Western country, but I imagine it's pretty similar in a lot of them, which is that, in large respect, what we want is we want narratives with beginning, middles, and ends, and some variation there, and there can be some ambiguity, but we want some things that are fixed, and yet there are other traditions of narrative in which there's something about not wanting the fixedness of having no control, and this is a film that I think is interesting. Like the characters, as audience members, we have no control, right? There's not a logic we can impose upon it as it progresses from each new sequence, right? We can try to make sense of them by trying to invent narrative that fills the gaps, but the film doesn't provide that. And I think
No.
what you're kind of talking about is there are a lot of film traditions where that's kind of the case. And for horror, it doesn't always work for me. I think it would be fair to say that I lean much more towards wanting there to be narratives, to be somewhat of a beginning, middle of an end of some kind. But in horror, I think what can be interesting about that is because it takes away that control from the viewer, that can be somewhat more terrifying, because the unknown is honestly one of the most terrifying things that we can imagine, right? The thing that we have no control over, the thing that we don't understand, the thing that doesn't follow a logic. And if we're talking about ghosts or haunted spaces or devils, right, those are things that like we can't impose any reason upon it. We can't make sense of it. And so it's beyond our control. We're basically at its mercy. And this film does that pretty clearly, I think, to make that clear, which is why I think I've said before, my favorite sequence is still the end of this film on the airplane, because that's when, all of your hopes are dashed against the wall.
Yeah.
You realize, oh no, this poor character has gone through these horrible ordeals and will not escape it.
Yeah.
In other films, if characters don't escape it, it's because they just died, and that's it for them. Death
Right.
is the end point. There isn't necessarily an afterwards. So like something like It 1 and 2, the new versions, right? They have a clear beginning, middle, and end. Each of those films, there's an end point. And if characters don't make it to the end, it's because they've died, and that's the cutoff. You just stop. But this film doesn't have that.
Not that they were already doomed, damned, and dead before the movie even began.
Right. Yeah, I think that's an important distinction. That in a lot of ways, the characters, or really explicitly, the characters in this, they're already doomed before we even meet them. Right. The second they show up on screen, if you rewatch this, they're already doomed.
And there's that sense of doom that we get in, if we look at, again, sort of like the history of the horror film, right? And certainly the dreamlike quality, again, where does the horror film begin? It begins in France in 1896. A lot of Georges Méliès' films, they're very cheery in their portrayal of demons and skeletons and things like that. But if you look at one of his films, I think it was very early in the 1900s, The Monster, which it is quite nightmarish. This portrayal of a man wanting his wife back, and it just this is from 1903. We just get this bizarre, literally dance macabre, and the body of his wife turning into this kind of jabberwock figure, and then finally a skeleton at the end. There's no real logic to it. It's just an unnerving set of images. And the first, where we finally get the feature length horror film with the Student of Prague in 1913, a man ultimately sells his soul to the devil, and then is confronted by his own evil double. That he finally kills, but therefore in doing so kills himself. The character's doomed from the get-go. But in it, and then The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, I mean, there, if we want to look at the most famous first real horror movie, and the audience plunged into a world that is completely unnatural, right? Good luck finding a right angle in that movie. And though a somewhat rationalist frame was tacked on prior to production, what lingers is the dreamlike or nightmare-like quality of the film and its narrative. the nightmare world of the horror film, was there from the start, and in some ways, despite the dominance it would then develop, the American branch of horror film storytelling is an offshoot, right? It comes later,
Right.
and then the inevitably would come to dominate. But we do have that period. Well, it's still happening in the 1970s, but from the 60s to the 80s, where we have a proper flowering of the European horror film in all its different forms, and where until it largely collapses in the late 80s. But we have that existence of this thread, this tradition of horror movies that is very different, even when we see it in dialogue with the American counterpoint. And for so long, it was hard for us to see these movies, at least as I was growing up. They would be essentially movies you would read about.
Yeah.
Maybe you wouldn't get to see. They might show up in very, very adulterated forms, and then in the 90s, it starts to become possible more and more in the home video age to actually see these films. But even before that, I remember one of my first experiences of a recent European horror film was seeing some of Argento's films like Phenomena and its American form Creepers and Inferno. And the experience of what you were talking about, of loss of control, of utter terror, because there was no way of predicting what was going to happen from one scene to the next. Right? The usual rules of, okay, here's the main character, here's how they're going to deal with a thing, suddenly went out the window. I had no way of knowing if this person was still going, that I thought maybe was the main character, was going to be alive or dead 2 minutes later. Just this avalanche of terrifying, strange images. It did feel like experiencing a true nightmare being projected onto the big screen. And I think that's one of the joys that Lisa and the Devil can bring to the viewer.
Yeah, I think a lot of that is things that we normally get to go into a lot more, if not for the fact that we've already recorded nearly an hour at this point.
Yeah, so we should probably wrap it up.
Yeah, I want to say just a couple of things as a last thing, which is that if you're interested in Italian horror cinema, Roberto Curti has a couple of books that are on the decades of the 1960s and then the 1970s on the Italian Gothic horror film. This film is talked about, specifically the version that he talks a little bit about, the House of Exorcisms, essentially copying of the Exorcist, which you mentioned earlier, David. So those might be things that people are interested in if you're interested in getting into more of this stuff.
I just want to add another recommendation to what you just said there, in the same vein, and that's Jonathan Rigby's magisterial trilogy of American Gothic, English Gothic, and Euro Gothic, which are comprehensive histories of those traditions in those three industries, covering just about every film, or certainly every significant one made during those periods. And so I think they're still in print. They're a little more, they're a little on the pricey side, but well worth it if you can track them down.
Yeah, and again, see if your library can get you access to it.
Exactly.
But all right, David, it's time for me to tell you what movie we're going to do next.
Time?
Yeah, you're going to be surprised because it's going to also be weird.
Okay.
We are going to be doing Sun Ra's Space is the Place.
Oh, that's a new one on me, so I'm looking forward to that.
Yep, that's what we're doing.
All right, so thanks, folks. That's it for today. If you'd like to let us know what you thought about this episode, head on over to skiffyandfanty.com/listener suggestions. Also follow us at Skiffy and Fanty on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our newsletter at skiffyandfanty.com/newsletter. Finally, if you like what we do, please support us at patreon.com/skiffyandfanty and give us some love by leaving a 5-star review on iTunes. And you can find me at David_Annandale on Twitter, and davidannandale.com, my sadly neglected website.
And you can find me at Sean Duke on Twitter, seanduke.net, or patreon.com/thejoyfactory.
Where he does lots of great stuff.
Oh, thank you. I try. All right, folks, that's it. That's all she wrote. So I need to make it awkward now because that's what I normally do on the podcast. Honestly, that's really hard to do with this film because all the things that are uncomfortable about this film are things that I really don't feel comfortable saying. So I will just note that if I ever die, David, I would like you to have me interned as a saint inside of a Gothic Italian castle.
Okay, cool. And I'm going to listen to some Rodrigo now and suck a lollipop.
And on that note, awkward ending and scene. If you want to support this show, you can go to patreon.com/skiffyandfanty or skiffyandfanty.com, our website, where you can get access to all of our fancy things. Our music comes from Holy Mole. You can support him and his work at patreon.com/holymole. Thank you for listening.